She was forced to marry an outlaw, until a warrior stood in his way. Thunder rolled across the Montana plains like cannon fire as Clara Whitmore stepped through the church doors. Her white dress, yellowed with age and borrowed shame, rustled against the wooden pews where townspeople sat in silence. Not one soul met her eyes. They knew what this was. A debt paid in flesh. Dutch Kane waited at the altar, his black coat dusty from the trail and his silver spurs catching the candlelight. His smile cut sharp as a skinning knife. Behind him stood 3 of his men, hands resting easy on their gun belts, watching the congregation like wolves counting sheep. Clara's father had gambled away their ranch to Kane in a poker game that lasted 3 days. When the money ran dry, he put up his daughter's hand as collateral. The law wouldn't touch Dutch Kane. Too many judges owed him favors. Too many sheriffs feared his reputation. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, his voice cracking like dry leather. Clara remembered her father stumbling home that night, reeking of whiskey and defeat. He couldn't look at her when he spoke the words that sealed her fate. "It's done, girl. Your promise to Kane come Sunday." She'd begged. She'd screamed. She'd even considered running, but where could a woman go alone in this territory? The wilderness would claim her before she made it 10 miles. Kane's men had made sure she understood the terms. One had carved his initials in their barn door. Another had left a dead rattlesnake on their porch. The message was clear: run, and everyone you love pays the price. Now she stood before God and witnesses, about to pledge her life to a man who collected women like scalps. She'd heard the stories whispered in town. 3 wives before her. One ran away and was found floating in the river. One tried to poison him and disappeared in the night. The third had lasted 2 years before she hung herself from the rafters of his cabin. Clara's hands shook as she lifted them toward Kane's scarred fingers. She thought of her mother's grave on the hill behind their old cabin, of her brother Joshua who died fighting for the Union, of dreams that had withered like prairie grass in drought. This wasn't marriage. This was surrender. Kane's grip tightened on her wrist. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco when he leaned close. "You'll learn to love me, girl. Or you'll learn to fear me. Makes no difference to me which comes first." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief. Old Tom Murphy stared at his boots. Even the children seemed to sense the wrongness of it all, pressed close to their mother's skirts. Clara stared at the crucifix above the altar, remembering how her mother had taught her to pray. But what prayer was there for this? What mercy could reach through the smoke and shadows of a bargain made in hell? The preacher's words blurred together like smoke. "If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." Silence stretched like a held breath. Kane's chuckle rumbled low and satisfied. Outside, a horse whinnied sharp and sudden. Then came the sound of boots on church steps. Heavy. Measured. The footsteps of a man who'd walked through fire and wasn't afraid to do it again. The doors swung open with a bang that shook dust from the rafters. A figure filled the doorway like judgment itself. Joseph Crow Feather stood 6 feet tall in worn buckskins, his long black hair braided with eagle feathers that caught the candlelight. Across his back hung a Winchester rifle, and at his hip rode a bone-handled knife that had tasted blood in more fights than most men could count. The congregation gasped. Children pressed closer to their mothers. Even Kane's men shifted nervous, hands dropping toward their guns but not quite drawing. They knew the stories. Joseph Crow Feather had fought alongside Crazy Horse before he'd chosen a different path. He'd tracked killers across 3 territories and brought them back breathing or bleeding, depending on their crimes. "This ceremony stops here," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of stone and steel. Kane's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold as Winter Creek water. "Well now, if it ain't the noble savage come to save the day." You got no business here, Redskin. This is a Christian wedding in a Christian church. Your God and mine both know this ain't no wedding, Joseph replied, stepping into the aisle. This is slavery dressed up in lace and lies. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. Older now, marked by weather and war, but the same man who'd sat at their kitchen table 5 years ago. The same man her brother Joshua had talked about during his last leave home. You remember me, Miss Clara, Joseph said, his eyes finding hers. I made a promise to your brother before he died at Gettysburg. Said I'd watch over his family if trouble ever came calling. Cain's hand moved to his gun butt. Joshua Whitmore's been dead 3 years. His promises died with him. A man's word don't die with his body, Joseph said, never taking his eyes off Cain. Especially when that man saved my life during the blizzard of '61. Found me half froze in a snowbank and nursed me back to health when he could have left me for the wolves. The church had gone dead quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Henderson's handkerchief trembled in her grip. Old Tom Murphy leaned forward, his weathered face tight with something between hope and fear. Joseph took another step down the aisle. Joshua told me about you, Cain. How you cheated farmers out of their land. How you burned out families who wouldn't sell. How you collected wives like trophies and buried them when they broke. Careful, Chief, Cain drawled, but there was acid in his voice now. You're making accusations you can't prove. Don't need to prove what every man in this room already knows, Joseph said. Behind him, lightning split the sky, throwing his shadow long across the church floor. Sarah Mitchell. Found floating in Willow Creek after she tried to leave you. Mary Catherine O'Brien. Hung herself rather than spend another night in your bed. And poor little Emma Rodriguez. Barely 16 when you claimed her father's gambling debt. Cain's face darkened like storm clouds. You're walking on dangerous ground, boy. Been walking dangerous ground all my life, Joseph replied. Question is, are you man enough to face me fair? Or do you need 3 guns backing you up to handle one Cherokee warrior? Cain's men spread out along the altar rail, their intentions clear. But Joseph didn't flinch. He'd faced worse odds in the war. He'd stood alone against cavalry charges and lived to tell about it. Clara's mind drifted back to that bitter December morning when Joshua had ridden home on his final leave. Snow had been falling thick as cotton, and she'd been baking bread when he'd brought the stranger to their door. Joseph Crow Feather had looked half dead then, his lips blue with cold and his hands shaking so bad he couldn't hold a coffee cup. Found him on the North Trail, Joshua had explained, helping Joseph to the chair by the fire. Bandits jumped him, took his horse, left him to freeze. Figured we owed him better than that. Their father had grumbled about feeding another mouth, but Joshua had that stubborn look in his eyes that meant arguing would be useless. For 3 weeks, Joseph had recovered in their spare room, teaching Clara to track animals in the snow and showing Joshua fighting techniques he'd learned from his grandfather. Clara remembered the night before Joshua shipped back to his regiment. The 2 men had sat up late by the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey and talking in low voices. She'd listened from the top of the stairs, her heart breaking at the resignation in her brother's voice. I ain't coming back from this war, Joseph, Joshua had said. I can feel it in my bones. Promise me something. Name it. If anything happens to Clara, if Pa gets himself in trouble again with his gambling, you look after her. She's got nobody else in this world who'd stand up for her. Joseph had been quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of sacred oath. Your sister will never want for protection while I draw breath. This I swear on my grandfather's grave. They'd shaken hands then, and Clara had seen something pass between them. An understanding deeper than friendship. A bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. Now, 5 years later, that promise hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Joshua had died at Gettysburg, cut down by Confederate grapeshot while charging up Cemetery Ridge. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday. Clara had read it 3 times before the words made sense. "He talked about you every day after you left," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said you were the finest man he'd ever known, red or white. Said if he had a brother, he'd want him to be just like Joseph Crowfeather." Kane's laugh cut through the tension like a rusty blade. "You want to know why I claimed this girl, Chief? It ain't just about her daddy's debt. It's about what her precious brother cost me during the war." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Joshua never mentioned crossing paths with you." "Course he didn't," Kane spat, his grip on Clara's wrist turning brutal. "Your hero friend never told you how he burned my supply wagons outside of Vicksburg. Cost me $50,000 in Confederate gold I was running to Richmond. Made me look like a fool in front of men who don't forgive failure." Clara's blood turned to ice water. She'd never known Joshua had encountered Kane during the war, but the twisted logic made sense now. This wasn't just about gambling debts or forced marriage. This was revenge served cold and patient. "So I waited," Kane continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the church. "Waited and watched. Heard about Joshua dying at Gettysburg and figured that was justice enough. But then I learned he had a sister. A pretty little sister with no man to protect her and a gambling fool for a father." Joseph's hand tightened on his knife handle. "You orchestrated the poker game." "Damn right I did. Marked cards, loaded dice, the whole works. Made sure that old drunk would bet everything he owned and lose it all to me. Including his daughter's hand in marriage." The congregation stirred uneasily. Even Kane's own men looked uncomfortable with their boss admitting to cheating in God's house. "Mrs. Henderson made the sign of the cross." Old Tom Murphy's weathered face showed disgust. "You see, Chief," Kane went on, warming to his subject like a preacher finding his rhythm, "I could have just killed Joshua's family outright. But where's the poetry in that? Better to make them suffer slow. Better to take his precious sister and break her spirit piece by piece, the way he broke mine when he burned those wagons." Clara tried to pull free, but Kane's grip was iron. "You're insane." "Maybe so, girl. But I'm rich and insane, which makes me dangerous as a rabid wolf." Kane's eyes found Joseph again. "Your friend cost me $50,000 in gold. I figure his sister's worth at least that much in suffering." Joseph stepped closer, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. "Let her go, Kane. Your quarrel was with Joshua, and he's dead. Don't dishonor his memory by taking it out on innocent blood." "Innocent?" Kane's laugh turned ugly. "Nothing innocent about the Whitmores. They got a talent for destroying other folks' dreams. Time they paid the price." But there was something else in Kane's eyes now, something that looked almost like doubt. The bravado was starting to crack, revealing the scared, bitter man underneath. Clara caught a glimpse of the boy he'd been before the war twisted him into something monstrous. "You know what the real joke is?" Kane said, but his voice shook slightly. "I was gonna be respectable once. Had a girl back in Missouri, planned to marry her after the war. But when I came back broke and broken, she wouldn't have me. Said I wasn't the same man she'd fallen in love with." Joseph's voice softened just a fraction. "War changes us all, Kane. Don't have to define who we become." "Easy words from a man who found his way back to honor," Kane snarled. "Some of us got lost in the dark and never found our way home." For a moment, Clara saw something human flicker in Kane's eyes. A ghost of the man he might have been if the war hadn't poisoned his soul. But the moment passed, and his face hardened again like cooling steel. "Enough talk," Kane growled, drawing his Colt .45. "You want the girl, you'll have to take her over my dead body." Joseph's knife whispered free of its sheath. So be it. The church erupted into chaos as guns cleared leather and frightened townspeople dove for cover behind the pews. Clara broke free from Cain's grip and stumbled toward the altar, her heart hammering like thunder. Lightning split the sky again, and in that moment of brilliant white light, she saw the truth written in both men's faces. One carried honor like a burden. The other bore revenge like a disease. And she was the prize that would determine which legacy would survive the storm. The first shot rang out like the voice of God himself, and Clara knew that whatever happened next would echo through these mountains long after the last echo faded into silence.